very helpful. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Demet Dinler from the Historical Materialism Editorial Board, and I will be your chair for tonight's plenary, Resurgent Reaction and the Rise of New Authoritarianisms. First, a little bit of information about logistics. After the plenary, we are all going to Marquis Cornwallis pub on Marchmont Street, which is a few minutes away from SOAS. We are hoping to see many of you there. There will be some food provided, but the drinks will need to be bought. There is finite capacity, and this means that after it is full, there might be a one in and one out policy. There might be also one tiny interruption during the plenary in the live stream. Do not worry about it. We will rectify. So thank you, first of all, for joining our biggest ever conference in London. So, yeah. So our great comrades from Historical Materialism Paris Organizing Committee are also here today. Thank you to them for being here. So I'm pleased to announce that we came very close to the record number of delegates that they achieved in June this year, 1,200. It has been a real pleasure to see regular faces and those who attend for the first time. And thank you so much for the rich, generative discussions and debates in panels. It was truly enjoyable and hopeful festival for all of us in those dark times. I would like to introduce, without losing more time, our plenary speakers. Wendy Brown is a distinguished American political theorist and professor emerita of political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Currently, she is UPS Foundation Professor at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. Drawing from Marxist, Nietzschean, Foucauldian feminist angles, Professor Brown has fundamentally shaped our understanding of power and the production of subjectivities over the past 3 decades. Perhaps she is best known to the audience with her research on neoliberalism assault on democratic principles, politics, and citizenship, as culminated in her wonderful 2 books, Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, and In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. She has also recently written a new introduction to the new translation of Capital Volume 1, edited by Paul Reiter and Paul North, whose launch took place at HM Conference this year. The readers of Wendy Brown would be familiar with her incisive, elegant, original reading of political text, but also her nuanced and astute insights on what we can learn from the analysis of the contemporary forms of power for an alternative political project. I myself first listened to Wendy Brown several years ago at another HM conference on Marx and religion, and I remember how it truly transformed the way I think about the text she analyzed. We are also truly grateful that she traveled overseas from another commitment this morning only to participate to our conference. So thank you for that. Cecilia Rikap holds a PhD from the Universidad de Buenos Aires, and she's an associate professor in economics and head of research at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is also a tenure researcher of the CONICET, Argentina's National Research Council, and associate researchers at Costec Lab, University of Technology de Compiègne. Cecilia is the author of the forthcoming Capitalism, Power, and Innovation from Versa. Did I say it? No, sorry. Cecilia is the author of the forthcoming The Rules, Corporate Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Apologies for the mistake. And we are hoping to do a book launch for her at next year's HM conference. She is also the co-author of the Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty report, a roadmap to build a digital stack for the people and the planet, which I think she talked about at this year's conference. And I recommend it to everyone, especially to teachers who want to give their students some source of hope about digitalization and AI. Jeffery Webber is professor at the Department of Politics, York University, Canada, with research interest in Latin America, Marxism, imperialism, politics of class, and social movements. He is the author and co-author of several books on Latin America, the latest one being The Impasse of the American Left with Frank Godiscio and Massimo Modonesi. And he's working on 2 new books, The Latin American Crucible, Politics and Power in the New Era and the Authoritarian Disposition, Capitalism, Liberalism, and Fascism. He has been a long-standing member of our editorial board, and you can see his sharp, analytical, and empirically grounded original research on Bolivia, Ecuador, and others in the pages of Historical Materialism if you want to get some old copies of HM, which have been available at our desk. And finally, Rafeef Ziadah is Senior Lecturer in Politics and Public Policy at King's College London. She has a PhD in Politics from York University, Canada. She worked as lecturer and postdoctoral research fellow at here, SOAS before. She is co-editor with Brenna Bandar of the book Revolutionary Feminisms, published by Warsaw. And she is also the co-author of Resisting Erasure, Capitalism, Imperialism, and Race in Palestine with Adam Henia and Rob Knox, which has been launched at EHM conference this week. Her research interests include political economy, gender, race, infrastructures, and maritime politics with special reference to Middle East and East Africa. I first got to know Rafeef, however, with her extraordinary and moving poetry work, and it would not be an exaggeration in my view to say that the clarity and eloquence of her poetry also reflects our interventions on political economy. So we wanted to keep the speeches of the presenter as a kind of surprise, so there have been no titles, but we all asked them the overarching simple question, and it's up to them to answer in the way they would like to address the question. What are the forms of powers which operate in contemporary world, and how can we make sense of them with respect to the rise of neo-authoritarianisms? Each speaker will have 18 minutes to speak. I will give them a warning before 2 more minutes. And then when we finish, we will also have a chance for Q&A part. We will only collect 1 round of questions to make it concise and precise so that we can enjoy our social evening without getting late. Thank you very much. So I invite our first speaker, Cecilia Rikap now. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. How are you? Good evening. I'm here to speak about corporate and political power and how they are mutually determined and constituting each other. And I will do it tonight by focusing on US big tech and the US government. I will not be speaking much about China. You can leave that for the Q&A if you want. But I will be speaking on how this mutual constitution of power is affecting the rest of the world, in particular, the parts of the world that I've been analyzing the most, which are both Europe, including the UK, and Latin America. And I would typically start this type of presentation by explaining that big tech companies are not only big because they concentrate data, data centers, talent, but also because they control beyond ownership. And this capacity to control beyond ownership, in their case, because of course they are not the only leading corporations that exercise these forms of control beyond ownership, and many others do so, but these companies in particular, okay. Yeah, well, they also make our world go dark with their AI, but these companies in particular, precisely concerning AI, they control the AI value chain. They control the different value chains of the production and innovation networks that are behind the AI, not only ChatGPT, but also the different forms of AI and digital technologies that we use on our everyday life and that organizations all around the world, with perhaps the exception of China and a few other places, are using on a daily basis. But I will not be focusing on all this, and I will not be giving you all these empirical details, because as I said, I wanted to focus directly on the epicenter of how this corporate and political power are mutually determined or co-constituted. And for that, I want to start directly for what I would describe as the epicenter of, in particular, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google's power, which is the cloud. And I assume that all of you probably store things on the cloud, and by this moment in time, you already know that the cloud is infrastructure as a service. So basically, you can store things there, and you can also run things there. In the past, for those of us that are not so young, we used to have CDs, and we installed, let's say, Microsoft Office in our CDs. Now we don't do that anymore, and we need to be always connected to their clouds, which means also to be connected to the internet, to be using this same software and services. But typically, when one thinks of the cloud, which, by the way, is a very concentrated market, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft concentrate around 65% of the global market. And the fourth player is Alibaba, which is based in China, and it only has 4% of the global market because, again, it's mostly just offering the same type of services in China. When we think of the cloud, even though we tend to think of the cloud just as a place where we outsource our infrastructure, where every type of organization outsources infrastructure, actually that is only the tip of the iceberg of what the cloud actually is. As you can see here, this is AWS Marketplace, and it looks very much alike to Amazon.com. The cloud actually is the supermarket of digital technologies. Every form of digital technology, software, models, data, platforms, even consultancies are offered as a service on this cloud. Thousands of companies that are called partners of, in this case, Amazon, offer their services there in a completely subordinated way and following the norms, the rules of how to develop the software and so on that are developed, that are decided, in this case, by Amazon. And the same happens with Microsoft and Google. But actually, the cloud is something else. So it's not only the supermarket of all the digital technologies for those of us living here. It's not just Tesco. It's actually the digital technologies space of production, exchange, and consumption. So if I want to bake a cake, I go buy the ingredients that were produced somewhere else. Let's say I'm buying eggs that come from a farm and flour that comes from whatever company and so on. And then I bake the cake and I decide that I want to then sell that cake. I go to another place, yet another place, and wait to see if someone wants to buy my cake. And then let's say I sell the cake. That cake will be consumed at a house, following the rules of the household. If it's a patriarchal house, it will be the dad deciding when everyone eats the cake. All this happens inside the cloud. So which means that the decisions on how digital technologies are produced, how they are exchanged, and how they are consumed are taken by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And the thing is that in this story, AI is a Trojan horse. Because it might be that AI doesn't, and in particular generative AI, and if you want, again, in the Q&A, I can explain the differences and things like that, but I don't have time for that today. But anyway, without knowing the differences of the types of AI, you probably heard of AI wide and large. And there is all this narrative about AI driving economic progress, AI solving everything from curing cancer to solving the ecological crisis. Actually, for these companies, it doesn't matter if AI delivers all this or not. Why? Because the simple fact that everyone wants to adopt AI makes everyone migrate to their clouds. So if you were not there yet, if you want to develop whatever software it's based on AI, you will need to do it on their clouds. And if you want to adopt AI as an organization, and meaning not only companies, but also universities, public offices, and so on, you will have to do it on the cloud. Which means that you will start using all sorts of digital services that you use for governing your organization, for managing the organization, for even governing a country, that are sold as black boxes. And this, of course, generates widespread dependencies, including also at the level of the governments. And here in the UK, last year, Starmer's administration signed an agreement with Microsoft for 5 years, where Microsoft will be driving the digital transformation of the UK government. It's not only Microsoft, actually, and the dependency doesn't concern exclusively the UK, which is, of course, as most of you may know, quite aligned with the government of Donald Trump. So why? Why do states accept to subordinate? Why is it that states around the world are simply adopting these technologies? And I think that part of the answer comes from the fact that, as I was anticipating, in order to govern, one needs information and information technologies. And this is the place where you get the most updated or frontier information technologies of today. So for public administration's everyday work, even the Brazilian government, who last year was claiming through its AI plan that it was going to decouple from big tech and have its own technologies, is now planning to migrate the public sector data to Amazon Web Services. And of course, when we speak about what the public sector does or the states do, that includes warfare, police surveillance, and genocide. And for all this, there are targeted digital technologies. And maybe you've heard about Project Nimbus, which was a special project that Amazon and Google had with the Israeli government to contribute with data centers and digital technologies for the genocide in Gaza. Microsoft also contributed in the mass surveillance, the largest surveillance episode probably in history. The Israeli government was surveilling every single smartphone from every Palestinian. And of course, it was a lot of data. So they couldn't store that data in their own data centers. So they used Microsoft Azure. And this is not just about the genocide. And it's not just about how these companies contribute to governments that are friendly or in alliance with the US government, because here you can also see how Mark Zuckerberg considered that Meta should provide data to the Chinese government in order to have a business in China. But what else? Is it just that it's about governing? Well, actually, as I was also anticipating, it's also about the promise of growth, a promise that AI will not deliver, but that the still governments are completely blinded about. And this has materialized in the authorization to install data centers. And data centers are not the place where the actual digital technologies are produced. Digital technologies are produced from all around the world precisely through the internet, and this idea of the cloud is that you can access the infrastructure virtually from everywhere in the world. So what is it about data centers? Well, data centers are mainly the place where, as I was saying before, this training takes place, this processing of the software and so on takes place. And for all that, the main input is energy. And the second one is water to cool the data centers. So basically installing a data center in a country means that the data center will be consuming more energy and more water as we speak, and will also be disrupting the local population without generating meaningful employment. The only associating employment in the end ends up being construction workers, because once the data center is operating, the companies hire at most 50 employees inside the data center and just do so for security purposes and maintenance. So it's not really a way to catch up or be part of the digital economy to install a data center in your territory. Nonetheless, one of the ways in which these companies have been promoting not only their technologies, but also that their technologies will bring economic growth is through the installation of data centers around the world. And while they do so, of course, expanding and worsening the ecological crisis, they are also selling governments technology as a form of AI solutionism to solve the ecological crisis. So this is yet another example of how the governments become dependent, because instead of thinking politically and strategically how to address the ecological crisis, they are outsourcing this to companies like, in these examples, Amazon and Google. But Microsoft also participates in this same type of services, where the companies use their digital technologies to provide perhaps a more efficient use of energy, or to anticipate some disruptions at the level of not only electricity, but also, for instance, in that case up there is about anticipating fires in the Amazon, or in this case it's Spain, not the Amazon, I'm sorry. But anyway, in all these cases, it's always about outsourcing how these companies, how to govern and how to solve the ecological crisis. So this deepens states' dependency. And at the same time, what is even more interesting is that it's not just that states around the world that come from countries that are not the US, governments are becoming dependent on these companies, but also the US government. And with Trump, we see a reinforcement of this dependency. On the one hand side, Trump revoked Biden's AI executive order, which actually was just a regulation that prevented certain harmful uses of AI, but it was not addressing the problems of who is producing AI, what type of AI is produced, with what data, and so on. So it was already a quite beneficial legislation for big tech companies. But still, one of the first things that Trump did when he got into the Oval Office for the second time was to revoke this executive order. But even more important is this decision that came with America's AI Action Plan, which is that basically AI means more cloud, and that the whole public administration is going to embrace not only AI, but also the cloud. And this includes, of course, as you've probably seen on the headlines, a lot of contracts with Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and defense tech companies. And you can see here some data on how this has evolved recently. Here, perhaps just to make a quick note, it's not the same thing to be Palantir, that of course has billionaire deals with the US government, than being a company like Microsoft, because Palantir gets 50% of its revenues from the US government. And if we include also the UK government and Israeli government, it's 60% of its revenues. Whereas a company like Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, what they are getting from a contract with the Department of Defense is not making a huge difference in terms of their revenues or profits. However, it is part of a more widespread or deeper way of addressing the way in which they build their own power, in the sense that by having an ally inside the public sector, they can use the government, among others, to deter other governments from regulating them. And I will go to that in 1 second, because actually with Trump's administration, one of the things that we've seen is that even in this America's AI Action Plan, very openly, Trump says that every US ally will also have to adopt AI and the cloud from big tech companies. So together, they are ruling over the rest of the world. They're not only telling governments what to regulate or whether to regulate AI, but also Trump was very openly saying that whatever government attempted to even levy a tax on these companies or regulate them in any way would face retaliations. And this, of course, was part of what the companies wanted and has already had effects. For instance, these days, Trump, it doesn't matter. These days, Trump is discussing trade deals with Cambodia and Malaysia, and they are including a lot of clauses that prevent these governments from regulating big tech companies. It's coming? No. I can just go there. But is this new? Is this new? Is this ruling coalition? Is the fact that the US government is contributing to strengthen the power of leading US corporations something new? Is it new that US leading corporations are contributing to strengthen the hegemony of the US? Clearly not. This is not new. And actually, this co-constitution of power has a history. And this history that I'm going to say very briefly is a very short-term one, because actually only refers directly to the emergence of big tech companies. But we can even trace it back to other episodes in the history of the US and large corporations. But in the case of big tech companies, we can first of all go back to the time of DARPA during the Cold War to remember that at that time it was the US Department of Defense planning the development of science and technology that became indispensable for these companies in the future. And it was not just about the development of the technologies that are at the basis of the type of technologies and science that they are monopolizing today, but also that it was the US government, the one that pushed the whole world to adopt its intellectual property rights regime and to transform its own intellectual property rights regime into a more stringent one to further contribute to the concentration of intangible assets in the hands of leading corporations. This included the possibility to, for instance, protect software, which was particularly beneficiary for these companies. And it was also, two other clear benefits can be traced in this short history. One refers to taxes. So the fact that there are globally tax loopholes and that these companies are capable of doing for what can be described as corporate arbitrage, where they decide where they're allocating their assets and paying the minimum corporate tax, has also been favored by the role of the US government, even in previous administrations, preventing the agreement of a minimum corporate tax, for instance. And another thing that in terms of regulations, okay, perfect. In terms of regulations, concerns, of course, antitrust. And I think that I don't need to explain much about that. But let me say that something changed. And you can see it already there with the back then Secretary of Defense of the United States, when he is saying that the Department of Defense no longer has the exclusive access to the most cutting-edge technology or the ability to support or control the development of new technologies that they once did. That internally the coalition is just a friendly one. And a clear example was the role of the US Federal Trade Commission during Biden's administration. Yet, it was also at the time that a particular report was released, one that was drafted by big tech CEOs and, among others, Eric Schmidt, former chairman and CEO of Google, who was here presenting it, and basically recommends to the US Department of Defense their investments for AI. And by the time when the Biden's executive order, AI executive order was launched, Kamala Harris clearly said it is American corporations that are the leaders in AI. It was not the US innovation system, US science and technology. It was clearly American innovation. So if this has existed before, what has changed with Trump? And I finish with this slide. Of course, the AI boom, and this has favored the US and particularly big tech companies and their closest allies, so the semi-core of companies that are developing the AI models like OpenAI or Anthropic. But there is more for me. I think that there is also a degree of legitimacy that was not there before. And just as an example, in 2014, Google had a contract with the Pentagon that was called Project Maven. We know about it because their employees disclosed it, and they criticized it so much that Google had to terminate the contract. We fast forward to today, and Google celebrates openly on its website its new agreement with the US Department of Defense. And the far right globally is no longer at the fringe of our society, but is at the center of our society, which contributes to this legitimacy. And perhaps there is nothing more illustrative of this than Elon Musk with the chainsaw that Javier Milei gave him. I think there's another change, which is the open US government support in all this story. Because yes, one thing was Kamala Harris saying American companies are the ones that are leading AI. Another thing is to have the US government purchasing 10% equity in Intel so that it doesn't go bankrupt, purchasing also equity in critical material companies, in companies that are developing like that are extracting rare earth materials or lithium in order to compensate for the vulnerabilities that the US has in global value chains that are connected, among others, to the digital economy. And at the same time, this example of the US government purchasing equity, so not just giving a subsidy, but becoming in part owner of these companies. For me, I also read this as a way in which the US government is trying to rebalance a bit the power within the coalition. And here we can think of the US government not as a democratic planner but, or a state planner, but actually it's thinking more with the mindset of these same companies as a corporate planner. It was not only the US government investing in Intel, NVIDIA did the same thing, by the way. And big tech companies have been paying anti-competitive fines for small things, an issue related to Amazon Prime, an issue with YouTube, but still they are just accepting that that's the cost they need to pay. Although they do fight back. And one of the ways in which they fight back is trying to convince governments around the world that installing their data centers and using their technology can still be sovereign, while in fact, what they are doing together with the US government and regardless of these internal disagreements is govern us all through their technologies by strengthening each other. And this is why, for me anyway, the result of this story is a strengthening of the authoritarian core. Thank you.
I'll give people a chance to leave who are trying to leave. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to thank the editorial board of HM for consistently bringing us together. None of them have to do this. They all do it voluntarily, which is quite amazing. So please buy them a drink and support the work that they do and sign up to the journal so we can keep coming together every year and having these very important conversations. So can I have a round of applause for the editorial board, please? I also want to give a special thank you for the editorial board of historical materialism for creating a space that has historically been openly anti-Zionist. That does not really exist. here, and I think that has to do with this very clear anti-Zionist stand of the editorial board on historical materialism. I wanted to approach our panel theme today, Resurgent Reaction and the Rise of New Authoritarianism, from the vantage point of West Asia. In particular, I want to think about the material and spatial forms through which US imperial power and local authoritarian regimes are consolidating themselves through petrodollars, the arms trade, but as importantly, ports, pipelines, energy grids, and digital corridors, and increasingly binding Gulf states with Israel. These projects are, of course, not new. They are the latest chapter in a much longer effort of US policy aimed at binding the region together under US hegemony through a framework of so-called economic peace. We saw this clearly after the Iraq War, when reconstruction and regional economic integration were sold as a pathway to stability and a so-called new Middle East. Each US president articulates a new vision of a new Middle East that integrates Israel into its core. In reality, these strategies entrench US influence, secure their authoritarian allies, and normalize Israel's position in the region while bypassing the question of Palestine. All this helps to explain how the right-wing authoritarian shift in the US is also reinforcing and being reinforced by the right-wing authoritarian shift in Israel, the Gulf, and elsewhere. We cannot understand Trumpism as just a product of internal US politics. So rather than treating the current and ongoing, stress on ongoing genocide in Gaza as something that began in October 2023, I want to think of it as part of this longer arc of reaction and authoritarian consolidation through a regional order that fuses US imperial power and authoritarian governance. To ground what I'm trying to say in something extremely concrete, I want to turn to a very silly but important document. I want to turn to a document that appeared, was so-called leaked from the US administration, called the Gaza Construction, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation Trust, the so-called Great Trust, because the dudes love their acronyms. It was a leaked document circulating within the Trump administration soon after the initial meetings we saw with Jared Kushner and Tony Blair. And of course, for anyone who knows anything in the UK or the Middle East about Tony Blair, where he appears just as follows. I turn to this document not because every word in it is likely to happen, but because it is very revealing of a particular mindset that is shaping US policy and regional elites as they imagine what is to become of Gaza. In that sense, it's a kind of diagnostic document. The document treats Gaza's landscape as a pre-investment stage for redevelopment pipeline. In effect, catastrophe is being recoded as an opportunity for investment, for territorial restructuring and capitalization. The plan rests on three mutually reinforcing pillars, each more discussing them next. Land financialization, infrastructural integration into Gulf, Israel, US corridors, including the India Middle East corridor, IMEC, and a population management regime combining displacement, labor extraction, and securitization. Let me quickly go through these three. At the core of the proposal is the creation of a Gaza land bank held within a sovereign-style investment trust. Land is to be aggregated and stripped of existing claims, leased to investors on 25 to 99-year concessions, tokenized via blockchain mechanisms, opened for fractional ownership and trading, used as collateral to attract global capital. In this schema, Gaza is transformed from a besieged territory into an investable asset class. The actual document says the year zero phase, they speak of a year zero, includes unexploded ordnance clearance, rubble removal, and temporary housing. This is the wording of the document. This is framed as an essential preparatory work for land monetization. Rubble is explicitly envisioned as construction material for roads and smart city platforms, rubble to be monetized and sold, and there are companies ready to monetize and resell the rubble. I will not even mention how many bodies are still under that rubble. Rather than the basis of a collective life or sovereignty or self-determination, land one who works on Gulf Capital, it is all the companies we are very familiar with. The second pillar of the so-called Great Trust situates Gaza's future within the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, IMEC, and the broader Abraham Accords infrastructure. Of course, the Abraham Accords are the normalization deal that were signed between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain to later include Morocco and somewhat Sudan. In this schema, Gaza becomes a logistical hinge in a corridor linking Indian ports to Emirati and Saudi logistics hubs, Gulf energy and capital to Israeli transport nodes, Israeli ports and grids to European markets. What we are essentially getting is a framework where goods are being shipped and moved from Indian ports through the Gulf, through Israel to European markets. This is the so-called vision of economic peace, completely bypassing Palestinians, using Gaza as a corridor where energy is integrated, cables are also integrated. IMEC is not just about port infrastructure, it is also about cables and data centers. The blueprint brands Gaza as an Abrahamic gateway, envisaging a logistics hub in Rafah, a desalination and renewable energy site in the Sinai, because who doesn't want a bit of greenwashing? Ring road and rail infrastructure feeding into Israeli and Egyptian networks, data center capacity tied to regional digital corridors. One of the main digital corridors is already under construction, hosted by Microsoft. What emerges is a vision not of Palestinian self-determination again, but of regional circulation, where Gaza's territory is harnessed to guarantee throughput of goods, energy, data, and capital in a securitized corridor for trade. This is normalization, not as diplomacy, but as infrastructural geopolitics, embedding Israel's settler colonial economy into Gulf so-called diversification agendas under US strategic sponsorship. To turn to the third pillar, maybe the most disturbing, concerns the population, the people. The document estimates that up to 500,000 Palestinians could be permanently relocated through incentive schemes. The document says they will voluntarily relocate, as if there can be anything voluntary when you are living under starvation in a besieged territory. They will have finance schemes to help people to transfer, and these transfers are justified through budgetary language. Each percentage of the population that permanently leaves Gaza represents a stated cost saving for the future. Ethnic cleansing is thus rationalized through financial calculation. For those who remain, the plan outlines a dual regime: integration into low-cost industrial labor and EV manufacturing and logistics adjacent industries, or incorporation into a vetted local security force, gradually replacing international mercenaries. So if you're a Palestinian with the option to remain in Gaza, you have one of two choices: low-wage labor for one of those industries, or to join the security service that is vetted and trained by Israeli forces. Urban design is explicitly informed by Haussmann's counterinsurgency logics. And I'm using Haussmann not because I want to, or because all of us who study geography have to go through Haussmann for a billion years, but because the document actually explicitly names Haussmann. The document actually explicitly says we need to redesign Gaza, and there's an entire new redesign that they put forward. They slice it into pie slices, districts separated by, of course, securitized green buffer zones, biometric ID systems, AI governance, and predictive policing. Gaza is thus imagined as a smart enclosure, engineered for surveillance, compliance, and labor discipline. This is why the Great Trust is useful to start with. It shows in almost cartoonish clarity how the long-standing US policy of economic peace continues to animate new forms of authoritarianism, animate and consolidate. It translates imperial power and authoritarian alliance into the language of a lot of the projects continue to be underway. Gulf sovereign diversification programs, emerging regional energy grids, and Washington's geo-economic push to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. And IMEC is explicitly placed as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. What this reveals is the material foundations of US-sponsored authoritarian order in the region, a fusion of settler colonial and authoritarian capitalism and US imperial infrastructure strategy. While the Great Trust might sound fantastical to us, it builds on an infrastructure that already exists and has been building through the region without us taking the time to analyze it. Long before this moment, the region was already being stitched together, particularly through energy grids. While much of the commentary on normalization usually focuses on weapons, and it's very true that Israel's military exports hit level records in 2024, the genocide was actually profitable for the Israeli arms industry, with around 12% of their sales going to Abraham Accord partners like the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. But what is actually less discussed is how gas and energy deals are doing even deeper, longer-term political work to tether entire national economies into Israel's infrastructure. The most visible move, of course, came in 2021 when Mubadala Energy, a subsidiary of the Emirati Sovereign Wealth Fund, bought a 22% stake in Israel's Tamar gas field for just over $1 billion. Tamar supplies much of Israel's domestic market and underpins exports to Jordan and Egypt. That deal marked the first time Emirati capital entered Israel's upstream gas sector. 2 years later, in 2023, Abu Dhabi's ADNOC and BP launched a $2 billion bid for half of New Med Energy, which holds a major share in the Leviathan field, the largest in the Eastern Mediterranean. The joint venture would have spanned Israeli and Egyptian gas assets, effectively placing ADNOC at the center of regional supplies. Talks paused during the Gaza war, but not stopped completely. They paused publicly only because of the instability in the short term, but the intention remains. Egypt and Jordan are, of course, very important here and deeply bound to this architecture. Both signed multi-billion-dollar import contracts for Israeli gas in the mid-2010s. Those flows have only intensified. As a matter of fact, while the genocide was ongoing, in the August of 2025, Israel signed its largest ever export deal, $35 billion contract to ship gas from the Leviathan field to Egypt through to 2040. The gas will feed Egypt's liquefied natural gas plants, which will then re-export to Europe. And this has been the European strategy, to try to replace Russian gas by Middle Eastern gas, and those Leviathan fields are playing that role. In effect, Egypt can become the energy hub that now depends on Israeli gas. In Jordan, a 15-year deal with Chevron, formerly Noble Energy, sees Jordan import gas for its grid, a contract that has been politically toxic. There has been remarkably brave demonstrations against it. And if you know anything about Jordan, you know it's not easy to demonstrate in that country. Repeated protests have come out. Yet the government continues to defend it as unavoidable for energy security. And why this is really important is because it binds the populations of the region to Israel in a way that every time you are paying for your gas bill or your energy bill in Jordan, you are supporting the occupation and settler colonialism. When Israel briefly suspended gas flows during the June 2025 war with Iran, it really exposed the dependency in the starkest possible terms. Emirati capital now sits in Israel's gas fields. Egyptian LNG plants rely on Israeli feedstock. Jordanian power grids are tied to Israeli pipelines. This is the reality we need to be aware of and to study and to confront. And many times we go into very deep debates about the history of Zionism, which is great. But can we also look at these materialities that are being built on the ground and how Israel is being normalized through these infrastructures? Normalization is not just an abstract notion or deals. It is being drawn in real time, integrating Israel into the regional economy and political architecture in ways that are making it difficult for us to contest. And in that sense, Gaza was a last stand for Palestine, and the people of Gaza were not just standing for their homes, they were standing against this regional order altogether. Importantly, for those interested in the climate crisis, normalization is consolidating an extractive order. I don't have time today to speak about every form of infrastructure that is being built and normalized. There are quite a large number of renewable energy projects that are greenwashing this normalization. I would urge you to read the last issue of Merib. It went through these various infrastructures. There's a lot for all of us to learn. But to end, I want to say, none of this is actually foreclosed. The US-led regional architecture, what Washington calls the New Middle East, is not seamless. It is riddled with contradictions, rival interests, and fragile bargains. Washington has doubled down on its alliance with Israel. We've seen that. European capitals may speak about statehood and issuing statehood bids, but that is just empty rhetoric when they go in the same direction and support Israel unconditionally. On the other hand, the Gulf, which has historically been tied to US power in the region, has to contend with its economic center of gravity now tilting eastwards towards China. That's why we're having all the debates and the discussion about what currency they're going to be trading oil in. Beneath all the fanfare of agreements and Jared Kushner's stupid ass face, there is no single regional order here, only a shifting field of contradictory dependencies, of actors trying to secure their place in a volatile hierarchy. These contradictions matter because they remind us that the future imagined by the Great Trust and IMEC is not inevitable. The maps and corridors may appear smooth on paper, but they rest on an unstable foundation, on violence, on racism, on war. But more importantly, they face resistance, a resistance that refuses to disappear, from Palestine to Yemen to Algeria to Sudan. And that brings me back to Gaza, because Gaza is where this entire architecture is laid bare. The Great Trust imagines Gaza as a corridor, a logistics hub, a site to be rebuilt, securitized into some Abrahamic nightmare. But Palestinians insist that Gaza is something else. It is our community, it is our struggle, it is our life, it is our history. Where their planners imagine a year zero, we assert memory, history, and return. Gaza and all Palestinians refuse to be tragedy. So let's see Gaza also as a horizon, the limit point of this global order and the site where it is exposed. Our task is not only to critique, it is to refuse a future being offered atop ruins, from Yemen to Sudan to Gaza's insistence on life, amid genocide, amid starvation, amid siege. This is not simply endurance. This is a challenge to all of you to demand, to imagine beyond empire from one of the poorest, most besieged populations on earth. liberation for Palestine, liberation for the entire region is the anti-capitalist horizon against which the architecture of empire has trembled for 2 years, and may it crumble in our lifetime.
So let's start from the premise that capitalist rule confronts an endemic problem of order. That problem of order is traceable ultimately to the primary social division that characterizes capitalist social society. The one separating capitalists, the owners of the means of production, and workers, those dispossessed of direct access to the means of life. From this basic division, there emerges at least 3 axes of tension and potential disorder across scales. From the firm, to the nation, to the region, all the way ultimately to the world system. The first axis is the horizontal conflict between capitalists, which is both a source of dynamism and of crisis. Horizontal conflict between capitals is a source of dynamism in periods of expansion, because among other things, the whip of competition compels individual capitals to discipline their labor forces and reinvest part of their surplus into new rounds of productivity-enhancing technological innovation. At the same time, it is a source of crisis because of the recurring problem of overaccumulation and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. What is rational for individual capitals to pursue in these contexts is irrational at the system level, catalyzing problems of crisis and disorder. A second axis is the vertical conflict between capitalists and workers. Again, from the scale of the firm all the way to the scale of the collective worker and the collective capitalist on the world stage. That their interests are fundamentally at odds is the most important source of an uneven but perennial problem of maintaining class order. A third axis has to do with the dominant territorially bounded form of political rule in the nation state and the fact that the logic of capital exceeds those boundaries, realizing itself most fully at the level of the world market. Historically, this meant the creation of a hierarchical chain of stronger and weaker states with uneven concentrations of capital constituting the world system. The problem of political order infuses all forms of capitalist rule running through these 3 axes with an authoritarian disposition. Just as all forms of labor in the history of capitalism, from slavery through debt peonage to wage labor, exist on a continuum of unfreedom and coercion, so too is the history of capitalism characterized by a continuum of alienated political forms of domination premised upon establishing and reproducing order appropriate to capitalist accumulation. One problem we are faced with is the different ways in which capitalist ruling classes have sought to impose order over the last several hundred years. We need to grasp both what is singular in each of these political forms and what is shared in terms of the authoritarian disposition that cuts through them all. In today's remarks, which draw on collaborative work with my friend Todd Gordon, who couldn't be here, I want to deal only with the question of specifically fascist resolutions to the problem of capitalist disorder. and to then think through the question of fascism vis-a-vis the debate concerning the second Trump administration in the United States. Fascism should not be seen as a radical departure from some ostensibly normal capitalism, but rather as a distinctive, extreme expression of the same militant defense of property, privilege, and racial order that motivated much of liberal history. Pseudoscientific racism, anti-Semitism, eugenics, colonial massacres, wars of conquest, campaigns of extermination, the impersonal bureaucratic administration of legal rational state violence, and the First World War were common elements to every European colonial power in the late 19th and early 20th century, elements defended systematically by liberal high theory of the day. In this sense, as Enzo Traverso has reminded us, Nazism's singularity did not lie, quote, in its opposition to the West, but in its capacity to find a way to synthesize the West's various forms of violence. In the first instance, what set fascism apart from its reactionary predecessors was the context from which it emerged. Above all, two depressions, the fallout from World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the possibility of revolutionary left emulation elsewhere in Europe, especially in Italy and Germany. An explicit theory of fascism is necessary in order to distinguish the phenomenon from other reactionary movements and regimes with which it shares certain ideological and sociological attributes. An adequate theory needs to encompass fascism across its distinct temporal rhythms, its embryonic emergence, its growth to mass scale, and its consolidation through state power, as well as its modal forms, fascism as movement, fascism as party, and fascism as regime. We can only hope to construct such a theory from the materials of history, using both contextualization and decontextualization. Following historian Jeff Ely, contextualization means, quote, to historicize fascism by being as specific as possible about its early 20th century dynamics of emergence, by isolating its characteristics as a locatable, historically specific formation, unquote. The second step, decontextualization, is to be understood, according to Ely, quote, in the historian sense of freeing the term from those immediate markers of time and place. Only then can we get to the process of abstraction that delivers the really useful knowledge we need for today, unquote. So decontextualization is a process of abstracting from history after close contextualization. In these remarks, I will only have time to make explicit the second step, decontextualization or the abstraction from history. The aim is to arrive at a theory of fascism which is portable across different periods of capitalist modernity after its origin in Italy in the 1920s, but not more expansively transhistorical than that. We arrive at what we take to be the core constitutive elements of fascism that we would expect to encounter in some form in any new fascist iteration. To anticipate an obvious objection, this is emphatically not an arbitrary empiricist inventory of features to which other features might be arbitrarily added or exchanged. It is a conceptual framework premised upon there being a master logic that coheres the elements into a totality organized around an axis or frame. That master logic in question is capitalist crisis on a civilizational scale. So here are the 8 constitutive elements of a theory of fascism. The constituent elements we would expect to recur in different forms in any new iteration. Again, the elements are intended to relate to fascism as both process and result, across distinct temporalities of fascist development and across its modal forms. First, with regard to context, the rise of fascism requires a severe and sustained crisis of capitalism, beyond the merely immediate conjunctural fluctuations, and which makes the normal process of capitalist accumulation difficult, if not impossible. Second, it is necessary that there be a foreboding sense of civilizational degeneration on the scale, but not with the same content that shaped the political zeitgeist from which classical fascism emerged in interwar Europe. Third, the crisis of capitalist accumulation must develop into a thoroughgoing crisis of bourgeois democracy. The fourth element of fascism is that in the face of that crisis of bourgeois democracy, forms of repression within the legal parameters of bourgeois liberal rule or outside of them through traditional depoliticizing military dictatorship prove inadequate, likely through trial and error, for crisis resolution on the terms of capital, that is, the terms of the restoration of capitalist accumulation and capitalist hegemony. The fifth component is the way in which fascism offers a solution to the inadequacy of bourgeois legal forms of repression or traditional forms of military dictatorship. As a reactionary and militarized mass movement with the capacity to mobilize supporters electorally, but especially in the streets through direct violence, fascism offers a mass movement-based street violence solution focused on the physical annihilation of enemies. The sixth component has to do with the petty bourgeois composition of fascism's mass base. While interwar European fascism drew cross-class support, at its core was a disproportionate petty bourgeois movement of small business owners, rural landowners, managers, civil servants, professionals, and military and ex-military members. Seventh, for fascists to take state power, they require widespread support from the capitalist class. And before fascists are able to take power with support from the bourgeoisie, they must first alter the balance of forces, inflicting partial setbacks to the popular class threats from below. In interwar Europe, this was a revolutionary threat from below. Eighth, and finally, there is assimilation into the bourgeois state and restoration of capitalist stability. With its victory, fascism is to a large extent assimilated into the bourgeois state apparatus, and thus the movement's extreme, unassimilable elements are necessarily liquidated, in particularly the so-called fascist left. Fascist rule is put to the task of restoring capitalist stability, the necessary conditions of accumulation and capitalist hegemony. I've highlighted 8 elements that we would expect to characterize any new iteration of fascism. It is clear that some of these elements exist today in the world system as a whole, where relevant, and in the United States specifically. There is, in fact, a severe and sustained crisis of capitalism beyond the mere immediate conjunctural instabilities, which can precipitate a radicalization of both the petty bourgeoisie and the ruling class as they search for an exit. There is, in fact, an increasing sense of civilizational degeneration and potential societal breakdown, expressed in, among other things, increased resonance of irrationalism, conspiracy, and perceived threats to so-called traditional norms of family and gender, adding another layer to the instability caused by capitalist crisis. And there is, in fact, the growth of militant, nationalistic, and revanchist petty bourgeoisie, which as a class has the capacity to form the nucleus of a mass movement, and which historically constituted the compositional core of classical interwar fascism. But other key features clearly do not yet exist. The depth of the crisis of bourgeois democracy is not comparable to interwar Europe, and notably, the challenge to ruling elites from below has not required more extreme forms of authoritarian intervention. Traditional forms of repression and dictatorial rule have not been shown to be inadequate in the face of working class resistance, and there has therefore been no need for recourse to fascist paramilitaries. In any case, at this point, fascist paramilitaries in the United States are nowhere near the strength, coordination, and discipline to play that role if called upon. And fascists have not been integrated into the American state in an organized and systematic fashion. What probably lies ahead in terms of Trump's successive inroads on the norms of liberal democracy is not fascist or single-party dictatorship, but what the liberal scholars Stephen Levitsky and Luc Enway call competitive authoritarianism. Of the many potential international comparators, one could do worse in this respect than to point to Orban's Hungary or Erdogan's Turkey. Under such competitive authoritarianism in the United States, the formal architecture of democracy, including multi-party elections, would remain intact. Political opposition would be legal and could challenge the established power, albeit on increasingly unequal terrain. And there would be no fundamental rupture with American constitutionalism. But competitive authoritarianism as a regime type does violate even the minimalistic norms and institutional commitments of liberal democracy, insofar as incumbents rig the game by deploying the machinery of government to attack opponents and co-opt critics. This obviously poses a real danger in and of itself, but the nature of the threat is distinct from fascist dictatorship and begs an appropriately tailored riposte from the left. That fascist movements are growing in the United States is a reality. We can trace their resurgence to the middle-run incubator of a growing militia movement in the 1990s, and the facilitating factor of state officialdom's rising racism, especially Islamophobia, during the protracted war on terror. The 2008 financial crisis and subsequent long economic downturn provided a conducive set of stimulants, with the COVID-19 pandemic and accelerating ecological breakdown providing yet more fuel to the fire. The Black Lives Matter mobilizations, the struggle for trans rights, and progressive movements against economic inequality were additional catalytic factors. Geopolitically, the rise of China and the relative decline of the United States in a scenario of global stagnation since 2008 are important parts of the world context for the rise of the far right in the US. However, fascist movements in the US are neither the most immediate authoritarian threat, nor do they define the Trump government. Trump's defeat in the 2020 election was an important setback for the MAGA movement, as was the fiasco of the January 6th Capitol Hill riot, in which paramilitary and street fighting organizations played a leading role. However, that regression was obviously short-lived. The movement regrouped and radicalized. With vocal support from Trump himself, 3%ers, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and other extremist MAGA activists strategized to take over local Republican organizations, Stephen Bannon's so-called precinct strategy, where they would be able to set the party agenda and install their members and allies in key positions. These far-right activists have taken thousands of local Republican positions in the last several years, giving them significant influence in the party throughout the country. Many Republican politicians have close ties to paramilitary groups and have participated in proto-fascist political actions with them, including intimidation of voting centers, threatening violence against the courts and political opponents, and aestheticizing violence in their political propaganda. Still, the militia phenomenon in the United States can easily be exaggerated. Take Germany's stormtroopers as a comparator. The SA was formed in 1921 as the reorganized paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. It grew rapidly from a paramilitary force of roughly 30,000 men in mid-1929 to 450,000 members in January 1932 on the eve of the Nazi seizure of power. The population of Germany in 1932 was roughly 66 million. For a paramilitary force in the contemporary United States to be proportionally comparable to the SA in 1932 would require about 2.3 million members. And this is to say nothing of the relatively scattered and uncoordinated nature of contemporary US militia groupings compared to the disciplinary unity of the SA. Reliable figures on the size and composition of far-right militias in the United States are difficult to acquire, but suffice it to say, the comparison with Nazi militias is extremely weak. According to a mid-2020 report in the New York Times, surveying expert findings on the subject, there were some 15,000 to 20,000 active militia members in about 300 groups. What is more, the article notes that membership of most of the 15,000 to 20,000 figure is reducible entirely to online participation. In any case, even if these dated estimates are conservative relative to today's numbers, and it is not at all obvious that membership is either bigger today than it was in mid-2020 or more concentrated in fewer or more highly coordinated groups, it is clear that American militias at this stage pale in comparison to militia strength during the high rise of fascism in Germany. Nor is ICE, as some commentators have suggested in the context of widespread raids in Chicago, the imminent presidential fascist militia that Trump has so far been lacking. Trump's recent use of the National Guard and deployment of Marines to Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., in the context of protests against wide-scale immigration raids, suggests that thus far, he has not found it necessary to use whatever influence he does enjoy over the actually existing disparate US militias. Finally, I want to add a little more to my comments on competitive authoritarianism by way of the legal ideology animating the Trump administration. Rather than interwar fascism, the most notable reference point for the ideas animating Trump's executive decrees is the quintessentially American unitary executive theory. It aligns closely with Trump's dismissal of recalcitrant bureaucrats, usurpation of control over federal agencies, and insertion of unqualified allies into the civil service. Unitary executive theory dates back to Ronald Reagan's presidency and attempts to centralize presidential control and weaken checks to executive authority within the US political system. The theory was extended by George W. Bush in the War on Terror. Unitary executive theory was consolidated further by the presidency of Barack Obama, witnessed the invasion of Libya without congressional approval, drone strikes, targeted killings of alleged terrorists, the administration's reliance on the state's secret privileges against forms of oversight. And it is instructive to note that the Trump administration's legal argument that they don't need congressional approval to bomb Venezuelan boats is built on a precedent established by Obama during the 2011 NATO air war over Libya. Trump's second term represents the radicalization of this legal tradition. The intellectual proponents of unitary executive theory defend it through explicit reference to the American Constitution. Likewise, Trump officials insist that their orders are legal, and his legal team is doggedly contesting opposing judicial rulings. In other words, Trumpian state managers have not yet launched a revolutionary attack on the constitutional order. They have neither sought to overturn constitutionalism like interwar fascism, nor mounted a violent defense of their particular reading of that notoriously white supremacist document against the extant juridical order. Instead, the Trump administration has relied on the existing legal apparatus to further its authoritarian ends, even while testing the limits of judicial oversight and due process. Such strategic machinations are less evidence of fascism imminent within the Trumpian regime than evidence of the imminence of authoritarianism within liberalism itself. Thank you.
Just take a minute to let people go. It's late. You're tired. I want to begin by just marking the fact that it's difficult to bring prepared remarks to a stage that Rafeef occupied 20 minutes ago. Her work, her vision, her strength left us all humbled, hopefully also incited and inspired. And Rafeef, we do not underestimate what it takes from you to offer us this. We hope to offer it back. I do think it's important to acknowledge that when someone speaks as she does and brings us worlds as she does, that it's also depleting and draining, and we hope we can shore you up. The question I want to explore is a prosaic one. Why is authoritarianism what many ordinary people in formerly liberal democracies now desire? We know that authoritarian politicians anoint wounds, mobilize fears and resentments, enable the tech and finance oligarchs who want to hold at least half, if not most, of the levers of government today. But how to explain the tolerance, the popular tolerance if not enthusiasm, for dismantling democracy. In the US, for soldiers and tanks in cities, masked ICE agents invading schools and homes, tackling old people, stealing children. In the US, for state takeovers of cultural institutions and universities, dictating the doable and the sayable everywhere. For trampling the Constitution while amplifying the power of capital, lining the pockets of the already rich, and cutting the bits of social benefits that remain after decades of neoliberal slash and burn. Why? Why are so many eager, or at least tolerating this, eager for, or at least tolerating this conduct? We obviously can't get the whole story in 20 minutes. What I want to do is tell some stories, identify what I take to be some of the important forces that may help explain authoritarianism's rapid consolidation in my country, the dying hegemon, to explain the ease with which it's being achieved. It's intentionally a US story for reasons that will become clear. It concentrates on the aim to de-democratize the state and the citizenry in two different governing rationalities. Those that have prevailed over the last 4 decades, neoliberalism, and it will surprise you, neoconservatism. Surprise you because neoconservatism is supposed to be dead. I'll say more about that. Far from identical or even commensurate, these two forms of reason together tilled the popular ground for an authoritarian state and yielded Project 2025, the playbook for much of what the Trump regime is doing. From dismantling the Department of Education to voter suppression, from mass firings of federal workers to undoing the basic institutions of liberal democracy via both nuanced legal maneuvers and bold power grabs to, of course, renewed imperial domination in all kinds of surprising as well as familiar parts of the globe. At 600 pages, Project 2025 is the most thoroughgoing plan for state-animated transformation of the political, cultural, social, and economic life that any liberal democracy has known. And I think the two forms of governing reason I want to discuss are at its heart. This claim will seem curious to many at first blush. We're often said to be both in post-neoliberal and post-neoconservative times. Neoliberalism is frequently declared to have suffered near-death blows from right-wing retorts to globalization, retorts extending from ethno-nationalism to tariff wars, and of course, also left liberal efforts to revive the big state. Neoconservatism is conventionally depicted as left behind by the discredited Middle East wars, the rise of the Tea Party, and MAGA. I'm going to argue that the American present is profoundly shaped by the bastard legacies of both of these forms. Neoliberalism, this room knows to the point of exhaustion, so I won't spend much time on it. At the level, let me be really quick. At the level of economic policy, deregulation, privatization, regressive taxation, financialization, assaults on unions, offshoring of union jobs, together, these exacerbated wealth inequality, stymied upward mobility, throttled middle and working class existence, producing an economic populism that the right spotted and mobilized well before the center left did. At the level of governing reason or political rationality, neoliberalism did something equally profound, which was to undermine constitutional or liberal or bourgeois democracy, whatever you want to call it, and also the very idea of democracy, attacking its principles, its jurisprudence, and the idea of a social compact, even legislated justice. In neoliberal reason, both markets and traditional morality are naturalized. Neither functioning markets nor good moral systems are born from human minds or intentions in the neoliberal understanding. They're not planned, they're not engineered, they're spontaneous. They require a lot of state support. But once they have that state support, they emerge naturally. Democratic legislation, on the other hand, is cast by neoliberalism as emanating from someone's idea of the good, imposed from above, and thus intervenes in these natural and spontaneous orders, always problematically, and is also said to overbuild the state as an actor. So neoliberalism opposes active democratic practices, especially legislated ones, and makes support for markets and traditional morality the only legitimate domestic state practices, along with defense. Neoliberalism's anti-democratic force is one important feature of the contemporary conjuncture, what I'm calling the popular receptivity to authoritarian statism. Its favoring of capital accumulation at every turn, its dismembering of society into individual units, its disintegration of the social compact, its economization of politics and of the languages and practices and institutions and jurisprudence of democracy. Its reduction of equality and liberty to market meanings, the equal right to inequality, as the neoliberals are fond of saying, and the freedom to buy, sell, and plunder as the limits on freedom. Neoconservatism may be less familiar to some in this room, especially the younger, so I'm going to take a little more time with it. It was born in the 1970s by intellectuals like Irving Kristol and even the philosopher Leo Strauss. It soon added some secular cold warriors, Jewish and Christian religionists, family moralists of all types. It picked up substantial steam in the 80s and 90s, by which time it had really become mainstream in the Republican Party. It's conventionally thought to have peaked and then crashed after the second Bush administration in the aughts. Discredited, as I said before, by the quagmires in Afghanistan and Iraq, for which its leading lights were responsible, Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, and others, but also challenged by the Tea Party movement with its principles of small government, fiscally tight, anti-regulatory libertarianism. But we're not living with Tea Party politics today. And MAGA, I think, is the direct descendant of neoconservatism, even if something of a bastard wild child. And that's why I'm trying to recall what those neoconservative principles were, how they soak deep in the fabric of the political culture of American life in general, and also deep into the Republican Party. So what was it? Neoconservatism responded to the upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s with a diagnosis that capitalism, for all its glories and achievements, has a downside. It frays the moral and cultural fabric of a people and discredits authority. This produces lots of individual licentiousness and indulgence, cultural decadence, liberation movements, and fractured families. It also, according to the neoconservatives, tends to take the state in the wrong direction, not only generating a redistributive state and other kinds of social justice, but it produces states that are internally and externally passive and anemic. So, neoconservatives promulgated strong states that would put their strength to use, both at home and abroad, align with and empowering corporations, replacing decadent popular culture with culture rooted in traditional values, religion, heteronormative families, of course, and also manliness, which was really crucial to the neocons. Transforming education, especially at the university level, and above all, promulgating and building patriotism, militarism, and war for regime change. At the neoconservative project's heart was the positive aim of linking state power and morality for both domestic and international purposes. The state was to recover some of its older theological dimensions, its moral authority, and its capacity to enforce it. Now, clearly, this moral political project, which, as I say, sustained the GOP and sank deep into the fabric of much of the working and middle class in the 80s and 90s and aughts, this moral political project departs significantly from the neoliberal rationality taking shape in this same period. But it also departs from standing conservative commitments to modest libertarianism, isolationism, frugality, and fiscal tightness. The neocons shed the classic conservative belief in limits and moderation, and in affinities with the aristocratic virtues of rectitude and civility and education and discipline. In abandoning these things, it accomplishes two ends. It becomes incredibly attractive to working class men, especially amidst globalization and disinvestment in education. The old Conservative Party, of course, was long regarded as the home of the educated and the wealthy. Neoconservatism is a very different dog. Moreover, it's ready to do battle for its project with the gloves off, that is, without regard for liberal democratic norms or processes. Neoconservatism is crypto-revolutionary. It affirms the values of authority and hierarchy, and it overtly avowed the use of state power to shape the nation and the globe. This was a break with the old conservative attachment to a modest and small state, limited reach of the state. In short, neoconservatism was not conservative, but right-wing and authoritarian. And it took the Republican Party in this direction, blasting past that party's classic commitments to constitutional democracy, fiscal responsibility, unrestricted liberty, and isolationism in relation to foreign affairs. In its place, it installed the precepts of a big, powerful state, including an anti-democratic judiciary, and several of our current Supreme Court justices, Scalia and Thomas, were shaped by neoconservatism's right-wing philosopher king, Leo Strauss. Moreover, it also installed the precept of restricting and, where possible, repressing decadent culture. It sought to outlaw porn before the internet made a joke of that. It sought to influence school curriculums and even to regulate hip-hop. It also installed the principle of developing a robust foreign policy, one that would reassert American empire, including, of course, devotion to Israel, and active efforts at regime change to, quote unquote, spread American values around the world. This was the language, especially, of course, of the second Bush, but was the language of all the neocons. In addition to legitimating authoritarian statism and imperialism, this project also politicized family, religion, and education in a novel way. It tightly fused family, religion, and education with Americanness and patriotism. Those who held traditional values were interpolated as true American patriots, which tacitly and later explicitly demonized the rest of us as un-American. It's a hyperbole one hears frequently among right-wing leaders today, as ordinary Lib Dems are tarred as radicals, terrorists, dangerous to the Republic, etc. Crucially, neoconservatives bound together family, religion, nation, and patriotism in a way that made economic precarity fall out of the picture for working and middle-class adherents to it. It identified its subjects with something other than class. It produced a distinctive identity for a working class, right? As unions were being destroyed, as jobs were being outsourced, as these classes were being cut off from education, as public education was being privatized, as upward mobility and access to cosmopolitanism were all being removed. All these things had been part of conservatism prior to neoconservatism. And they had been part of post-war American capitalism prior to neoliberalism. They're all off the board now, and in their place is God, family, and country. Increasingly, this bound working and middle class adherents to this way of thought, that is, those who we understand as having brought Trump to power, it bound this class to the authority and hierarchy of church, traditional family, and the neocon version of the state. Now, in the past decade, several things happened to the original neocon vision. As I said, there's no one who now calls themselves a neocon. No one claims to be one anymore. But what was produced by the neocon decades, there were three of them really, 3 decades, was this authoritarian, anti-democratic ambition that soaked the fabric of the GOP elite and base and became normalized as mainstream conservative politics. It's really, as I said, right-wing politics at the top, not conservative at all. It also legitimated the powerful state and the right-wing transformative state. A state that, like Orban's in Hungary, aims to remake the economy, the culture, the family, the education of the country to place traditional values at the heart of the nation. Of course, it also legitimated militarism in general and increasingly militarized policing inside American cities, as well as using American military power around the world. Above all, it legitimated regime change, which, even if briefly discredited because the forever wars were discredited, was bound to come home. Regime change was bound to come home, and it did come home. It's now being applied to the American Republic. Regime change for the US is what Project 2025 details over its 600 pages. It specifies exactly what to do and how to do it, just as the Bremer Orders, those governing principles of Iraq after Saddam Hussein was toppled and Bremer was installed as its provisional manager, just as those provided details of regime change and the making of a new state and culture and political economy for Iraq. Thank you. In the case of Iraq, the design was for a relentlessly neoliberal order with a finesse of liberal constitutionalism. In the case of Project 2025, the project is for a right-wing authoritarian order. It aims to transform the liberal democratic state and its institutions, political economy, and culture, again, just as surely as the US sought to transform the Iraqi Ba'ath Party state into one suited to becoming an international playground for capital. To conclude, over the past several decades, with neoliberalism's naturalization of markets and traditional morality, its economization of the principles of democracy, its tarring of democracy and democratic legislation as totalitarian social engineering, combined with neoconservatism's affirmation of strong state power, hierarchy, authority, and binding of traditional values to patriotism, the ground was well tilled for interpolating a population against its economic interests and in favor of an authoritarian state. We Marxists, I believe, need to pay attention to political subject formations like these. Otherwise, we won't get our analysis right or our organizing right. We won't understand what kinds of political subjects these histories have produced and how to reach them. They're more than dethroned white workers manipulated by plutocrats. These political formations matter in constructing parties, subjects, and states in what they legitimate and normalize, in what they delegitimate, hystericize, and marginalize, and what desires, communities, and attachments they produce. The point isn't to substitute analyses of these formations for class analysis, but to understand how class takes shape and is mobilized within them. The little hopeful bit in my story. You're looking so glum. Zoran showed us how to reach into this formation and turn it by treating affordability, the right to the city, as a traditional value. Quoting Zoran, the people who work and raise families in New York City need to be able to live here. Also, by making New York City into a collective object of love and belonging. It belongs to us, he said, day after day, not the billionaires. Zoran revived patria in its original sense, its original Latin Roman sense, belonging in love of the city that one also builds and protects, as opposed to attachment to the nation, the abstraction of the nation with flags, with militarism, etc. Of course, Zoran Mamdani is also wondrously charismatic and smart. He's especially brilliant at linking principles across the local to the global. New Yorkers' right to live in New York is no greater and no lesser than Palestinians' right to live in Palestine. But his campaign, not just his persona, showed us a way back from the brink of fascism after these ghastly decades driving toward it. Thank you.